Why did the United States capture Nicolas Maduro if it had already foreseen the risk of chaos? When the US government seized Venezuela's president over the weekend, much of the world was shocked. But behind closed doors, US officials had already been gaming out what might happen if Maduro was ousted. And in every scenario, the result was pretty much the same: disaster. Today on the show, I'm speaking with someone who was in those rooms. His name is Douglas Farah. He's a former Washington Post journalist, and he was a war game planner during various administrations, including President Trump's first term. From the BBC, I'm Asma Khalid, and this is The Global Story. Can you describe to us what a war game is and why a government would want to do it?
Is where you sit down and you look at, okay, this is the situation. In the case of Venezuela, okay, well, this is what we have now. What happens if the regime changes? And how would that regime change? What happens if Maduro's gone? What happens if there's a popular insurrection? What happens if nothing happens? And then you bring in a group of people who theoretically know what they're talking about, and you look at all the different economic data, the different military scenarios, the different social scenarios, and say, this, if this happened, this is what would likely happen.
And what actually happens?
Usually is a full day, at least, sometimes 2 days, where you then go through the scenarios, and then different people. I mean, there are ones that are interagency, where the State Department, the National Security Council, the Pentagon all participate. Some will say, okay, now the price of oil rises to $100 a barrel instead of 40. That gives them a lot more resources. What dynamic would that change internally? Or Russia has decided to send new MiG fighters to bolster Venezuela's defenses. What would that do to the ability to repress? What if they give training in specific repression techniques and bring in the Cuban counterintelligence to look at where their leaks are and how to crack down on people? How does that play out?
And are you sort of discussing this in the abstract, or are you role playing? Is there a sense of theater behind this?
In some, you're assigned to a team. So you're the red team, which is the team that's trying to be the bad guys in the scenario from whatever.
Bad guys being
the Bolivarian army and how they would react, let's say, in Venezuela.
I see.
How would their intelligence structure react?
Okay, so there's a red team, and then there's also
with a blue team.
And the blue team is the U.S.?
The blue team is the U.S. And then what about Brazil? Brazil's not red or blue. How would they react to what do you see going on? What would they do with their borders? Would they support the Maduro regime? Would they withdraw support from the Maduro regime?
Are you all sort of taking on the role of one of these actors?
You're supposed to be acting as if you were those actors. You're the Venezuelan military.
So did you take on a role, for
example?
Sure,
yeah. Usually not the blue team, because I spent many years in Latin America around guerrilla groups and stuff. So my expertise, I think, was more valuable in saying, I think this is what this group would do.
And your job is to sort of embody and act out how they would behave in real time.
Right, exactly. You try to think through what the United States would have to think about.
Why was Venezuela such a focus of the United States for so many years that the government was gaming out these contingency plans for years, you say, dating back to the Obama White House?
There are a lot of contingency planning for probably almost every country in the world. So it was not unique to Venezuela. I think when things began to really heat up, when we saw in the early mid-administration, Obama administration, when we saw the Cartel de los Soles really sort of forming into different power structures.
And this is the cartel that the U.S. government says that Maduro is the head of.
Right, and that it's a terrorist organization now that Trump has designated it. When we saw the FARC guerrillas in Colombia really moving aggressively.
And the FARC, can you define that?
The FARC is the guerrilla group in Colombia that was founded in 1964 and had been fighting the Colombian government since then until they signed a peace agreement in 2016. So they were armed and financed by the Maduro regime. We had other terrorist organizations there. Iran was becoming much more involved. At the time, Russia was making a big push, and China was just coming in. So that was a national security concern, was what is the FARC guerrilla group doing, and how are they tied to the Venezuela regime?
So let's talk about the different scenarios that you gamed out. I want to speak about this chronologically to the degree that we can.
Right.
So, what was the primary scenario you mapped out during the Obama years?
We looked a lot at what the economic situation, because they were in a constant state of crisis. During the Obama years, there was hyperinflation of several thousand% a year. So people had nothing to eat. They couldn't buy anything. So what was that going to bring down the regime?
So you began with kind of the economic pressure.
Right.
And then where did your war game scenario move on from there?
Our basic determination in thinking was that the regime would probably not fall. And then what we saw and what we were talked about a lot, which then did come to pass, was the massive migration out of Venezuela due to the economic hardships. So
You gamed that out.
we did not expect it to be, I don't think, at least I didn't, as massive as it was.
See millions of people.
8 million people. We thought that people would start leaving because of hunger. We did not factor in the fact that Maduro did in fact let a lot of people out of prison and sort of orchestrate then a lot of people leaving that have wreaked havoc across the region. But it was clear that when people get hungry and their children are sick, they're going to look for a better place to move to, and that was clear that was going to happen.
And that was where you saw that story sort of ending. The outcome was that Maduro would stay in power. There would be a mass exodus of people. Let's move to Donald Trump's first term in the White House. You continued to map out different scenarios, you say, with the Pentagon during that time period. And to be clear, you had said earlier, you didn't look at removing Maduro from power, but you did look at a day after plan. What happens next? Did you do that under the first Trump term? And can you play out the scenario, how it unfolded?
Well, we were looking at, because there were a lot of internal fissures within the Maduro regime. So what happens if Maduro is removed? Could you then, I think we're trying to do now, move the remaining regime toward a democratic transition?
Removed by whom?
By the Venezuelan military,
right.
An internal coup. They'll give you specific, like say, variables. Okay, so Guaido lands in Caracas, or Maria Corina Machado
One of the opposition leaders
lands there. What happens if there is an internal coup and Maduro is no longer there? What become the power centers?
What was the context in 2019 that made the Trump administration consider gaming out Venezuela and gaming out a possible day after plan?
Well, at the time you had, again, an elected government from the opposition. It seemed as though Maduro might be forced to recognize him. And you had a broad coalition of Latin American countries behind the opposition, publicly behind the opposition. You had Chile, Colombia, Brazil, maybe already Ecuador. You had very important Latin American countries also on board with putting the humanitarian aid and saying, we can help you with your humanitarian problem and recognize the elections.
And Maduro was looking vulnerable.
And Maduro was looking very vulnerable. When it seemed reasonable to think that you had a sufficient correlation of forces that could actually damage the Maduro regime. And our assessment was that was not true, that they had not yet reached that point, where a tipping point for the Maduro regime.
So your final assessment was that it was not a tipping point, but you were gaming it out, you said. And during the game itself, were you on the red team, the quote-unquote bad guys team?
I was
during that
almost
time?
always on the red team.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Presumably trying to retain power.
Right.
How did you all do so at that time period? Do you recall?
Our assessment in the end was that the repressive apparatus was so well entrenched and that there was no trust at all built with the opposition trying to come in, that they could keep control of territory and social scenarios if they could keep enough food and other things flowing to the population, which is, at different times you saw Iran bringing in a lot of capacity to refine gasoline, which Venezuela as an oil power doesn't have. It can't make its own gasoline. We saw Russia coming in with trying to do new oil exploration and trying to up the oil production and different things. I think none of that went as well as I thought it would, but it also, the regime didn't fall.
So your team won. Well, your team.
The team, the state,
the quote bad guys team. You're saying, or the red team.
The group of us that predicted the survival of the regime under almost any circumstance turns out to have been right so far.
So after that war game in 2019, you wrote a report for the Pentagon about the possible consequences of removing Maduro. What did your report say?
Well, we essentially thought you would end up with widespread chaos for a long period of time because, again, you wouldn't have a central government. You wouldn't have a command and control structure. I think what's different in what we're seeing now from what we wrote about at the time was that so far the military has not fractured. I think that over time it may well still fracture, which would lead to essentially a creation of a series of almost mini states within Venezuela, where you had a central government that's a husk of government that controls the capital. Not too distinct from what Syria became in the end, where the Assad regime could control Damascus and not a whole lot outside of Damascus. They could control Caracas.
Douglas, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying, though, is in these various scenarios that you mapped out, no successor of Maduro's, even if it came from within his orbit, could successfully control the country. This was in 2019 time period, you're saying, and yet Maduro was. Why would he have been able to continue control of the country?
That's a really good question. I think, we didn't say no. We thought the most likely successor who had a chance would be Diosdado Cabello. Maduro was essentially a really good traffic cop at keeping everyone's interests close enough together so they didn't fly apart. We did not think that any of the other players had the capacity to unite and keep the sort of corporate board functioning.
I want to jump ahead to your work during the Biden administration days. You also mapped out different scenarios of what might happen then. What was the principal scenario that you gamed out during that period? Did you also look at the day after Maduro plans during that time period?
Not nearly as much. What we did mostly during the Biden administration was look at how different criminal organizations intersected with the regime, because the Biden administration was not focused on regime change at all. They didn't focus a lot on Latin America. And I think their general view was that Venezuela was not a particularly large threat to the United States when they had Afghanistan and other wars still going on. So we did a lot of analysis of criminal groups and extra-regional groups in Venezuela and the region.
Did you look at economic pressure?
We did, and we looked at
sanctions. I know that the administration used quite a bit of around the world.
I'm glad you said that, because we spent a lot of time looking at what viable sanctions would be like. There were multiple levers of economic sanctions on the elite, not on the general population, that were never used. If you buy into the assessment, as I do, that the primary motivation over time was financial, not ideological.
For Maduro.
For Maduro, then to cut off the financial flows is what would really damage them.
And so you were looking at how to cut off those financial flows. And the primary way to do that was what exactly you're saying?
There were multiple sanctions that were enacted, and many more, I think, that could have been enacted.
Can you walk us through that?
I have to be careful what I say here. There are ways to identify individuals who were moving money out of Venezuela to European and then Hong Kong and other safe harbors, the Caribbean safe harbors, and also the United States as safe harbor, from multi-layers of shell companies and ways to move their money that were not immediately detectable as coming from the regime.
Okay.
But for example, we mapped out a process where they moved $3.3 billion from the Maduro regime and elements of the FARC through El Salvador. That was one through their oil company, the Venezuelan Petroleum Company.
The state oil company.
The state oil company. So it's not easy. I mean, it's a complex system, and the big problem with all that is you have to have a very high level of proof to show that in fact it's ill-gotten gain as opposed to state activity.
I want to ask you about what we have seen transpire over the last few days. The one thing that it sounds like you all never war-gamed out is indeed what just happened.
Yes.
A special operation to capture Maduro in the middle of the night, fly him to the United States to face trial, and then announce that the United States is, quote, running the country, it seems through some sort of extreme pressure campaign on Maduro's vice president, who is now the new president. why don't I begin by just asking, why was that something that was never wargamed?
I think the possibility of kidnapping a sitting head of state in the Western Hemisphere did not cross any of our minds, really. And if you're looking at realistic options of what might happen, a realistic option it would be like, a star fell out of the sky and hit him on the head. I mean, it just didn't seem, and I think that every administration from George Bush 1 forward was very careful to try to make the reestablishment of democracy and rule of law in Latin America a primary policy issue. And so no one was talking about taking back the Panama Canal like Trump is now. No one was talking about taking over Greenland or wanting Canada to be our 51st state. Like, that was not what the discussions were about. It was how to build bridges. And famously, Obama met with Hugo Chavez in a Summit of the Americas meeting and tried to have a conversation went to Cuba and they normalized or semi-normalized relations with Cuba. All of those things were a way of trying to move the United States toward friendship with the region, and not so it would just why didn't we think about it? It was be like thinking about why don't elephants fly? Like, it just didn't there was no reason to think about it.
So what did you think when you woke up on Saturday morning and saw that this news had happened?
I was really stunned. I just, it was not, I didn't think that that even the Trump administration would go that far. I mean, I've worked around special forces and folks for a long time. The capability to do something like that, absolutely. So the fact that they could do it didn't surprise me. The fact that they did it surprised me enormously. I think it's going to be downhill from here because there doesn't seem to be, and my immediate thought was, because we had spent a lot of time looking at this and then looking at the migration patterns out, food insecurity is so high in Venezuela. They won't have any gasoline, they have no medicine. If we don't have a plan to come in and meet those felt needs of the population very quickly, everything we've done will lose legitimacy very quickly. Because we've seen in all the occupations I've looked at across the world, people get very hungry very quickly, and then what they say almost immediately is, well, we were better off before. Why did you take Maduro when we at least could buy bread? Now we can't buy bread. We don't have gasoline, nothing works. So and there doesn't appear to be a plan in place with this operation to bring in anything except one, they seem to be hoping the oil companies will come in and start doing things. That is not a way to legitimize or move people to your side, because it's not an ideological thing. It's the life and death existential threat, whether you can eat or not, and whether your kids can eat, whether they can get to a hospital and get medicine.
So in all the war games that you've described for us, that you were involved in, is it correct, my understanding, that all the scenarios essentially always ended in sort of disaster, even if it was an involvement of doing nothing and the status quo just remaining the same? None of these seem to end well in the scenarios you did? That's
exactly right. We didn't have any scenarios where we thought, this is what, this would play out well here, and we would get to where we want to go, because everything requires not only a political alignment and sort of the ability to execute multiple things simultaneously, but an enormous amount of resources to come in behind. You have to make massive investments. You have to have the humanitarian aid package. You have to have the business package. You have to have everything come in. And it seems clear when we were doing all of this and now that the United States is not prepared to do that. And maybe it shouldn't be. I'm not saying it should be prepared to do that. But if you're going to do that, you have to have the ability to then do something on the ground to make people's lives better at the cost of what you just did.
Thanks, Douglas. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Many thanks to Douglas Farah for sharing his expertise with us. Now, before I wrap up today's show, I wanted to ask for some help with a special project that we have. All next week, we're going to be doing crossover episodes with some of our sister podcasts here at the BBC, shows like Ukraine Cast and Focus on Africa. We're going to be looking at the New World Order, countries that have influence and what they're doing with that power and influence. And we'd love to get your questions, suggestions, or thoughts. So if you've got ideas, you can send us an email at theglobalstory@bbc.com. Thanks as always for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.